on the American Revolution. And if we think about the American Revolution, you have to think about the revolutionary ideals that are really going to start to impact the thinking of people who are very important for sort of pushing for this revolution to take place. So the revolution began in a remarkably Republican culture, which explains why Americans were rapidly converting to different revolutionary principles. They believed that the British system of government, which did have checks and balances, was a good thing. And you can see, in addition to that, that Enlightenment ideas presented by men like Montesquieu are very, very important to the founding fathers. In addition to that, at this point, you can really start to tell a lot about what people in the colonies are thinking based on what they're reading and based on kind of where their mindset is. And it's different from now. Now, if you wanted to know what people were thinking in, 2017, you could just get online. You could find some threads on Twitter or Facebook and kind of get a feel for what, certain people were feeling. But at this point, you really see it through pamphlets, you see it through people's letters, through their writings, and people are really fond of sort of radical ideas that are floating around on both sides of the Atlantic. Ideas like representation being more exclusive, ideas like being a little bit more Republican with your government, and of course, ideas in the Enlightenment and really this sort of political culture that is emerging. They're questioning the world around them. They're questioning the role of monarchs. They're questioning the role of parliaments. What should a government do? How should it protect people? Should it just protect people and their property? Who's included in this? And different things like that. So these revolutionary ideas, again, they're on both sides of the Atlantic, but you really start to see them coming through in the colonies. So, as far as the lead up to the war, not only do you have these revolutionary ideas that are sort of circulating around, but the 7 Years' War, the end of that war, is really going to start to change the North American colonies. So, if you want to know more about the 7 Years' War, if you look it up, I believe there's a really good crash course U.S. history and a world history video if you wanted to sort of refresh yourself on that. But for us, we're a little bit more concerned with the aftermath of the 7 Years' War as opposed to the actual war itself. So when the war ends, the colonists really think that they are going to get a good end of the deal, because during the war the British depended very, very heavily on the colonists, not only for food and shelter but also for manpower. A lot of the men helped to form militias that helped them to win in this North American front of the war. However, after the war, they find increasingly that the king is not supporting what the colonists thought they were fighting the war for. So, for example, a lot of colonists who fought in the 7 Years' War believed that after the war, once they had defeated the French and the Native Americans who had sided with them, that they would be able to take over that land that the Native Americans had. However, in 1763, the king, you're going to see the proclamation line of 1763. You can kind of see it drawn out right here. And essentially, this line is a line that cannot be crossed by colonists. Of course, some people do, but legally, you're not supposed to cross that line and to start settling anywhere else in that area. So, a lot of people are really upset about this. They thought they'd have more land, a chance at more prosperity, and here's the government telling them they can't. In addition to that, the colonists thought that they had already paid for this war. In their mind, by supplying the food, the shelter, and the manpower, they had already paid for this war, and they didn't see the need for any taxes to help pay for it. However, in the following years, you're going to have the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act passed in 1765. And of course, you can see there are other acts that are passed as well. There's more about that in your reading for this week. However, the colonists don't really see this as fair. Now, one thing to point out is that in the colonies, those who lived there, they considered and understood themselves as British subjects. However, they didn't pay nearly as many taxes as people who lived in England. They paid a lot less in taxes, and because of that, they were really hesitant of paying more tax. In addition to that, the Sugar Act of 1765, it actually lowered the taxes that were put on different goods like sugar, molasses, and rum. It actually lowered the tax. However, in the colonies, they were so used to not paying the taxes when they were supposed to and finding ways around it that this act, which again, it lowered the taxes, but one that was going to be more heavily enforced, to them it still felt like their taxes were being raised and they felt like it was an invasion of their freedom. As far as the Stamp Act, this is one that's really a defining factor as well. The Stamp Act affects a lot of people. So anything that's paper has to have the stamp on it, and you have to pay that tax. So of course that includes things like legal documents. It includes newspapers, playing cards, anything that's paper. And if you think about two groups that are going to be very heavily affected by this, lawyers who have to now get stamps on their legal documents, and people who own newspapers or printing presses who are now going to have to get stamps on all of their sort of merchandise as well. And of course, people who own newspapers or people who print pamphlets are going to be printing a lot about being against the Stamp Act. And of course, people who are lawyers are going to be arguing against it as well. And that is going to eventually lead to the Stamp Act Congress, which is also laid out in the book if you'd like to look at that. But this is where you really start to see people from different colonies coming together, creating the Stamp Act Congress in order to send some interestingly worded documents back to England to let them know how upset they are about the Stamp Act. And eventually the Stamp Act will be repealed because of the Stamp Act Congress. So fast forwarding a little bit, another event that I wanted to cover in today's lecture is going to be the Boston Massacre. So by March of 1770, there were 1,700 British troops who were stationed in Boston, a city of around 18,000 people. On the evening of March 5th, boys began throwing snowballs and insults at the lone soldier who was guarding the Boston's customs house. An angry crowd then began to sort of come out when they saw the boys doing this, and they joined in. However, they weren't throwing just snowballs, but instead they were throwing rocks, snowballs filled with rocks and pieces of glass, and a lot of other dangerous things at this soldier. One thing that we really need to think about is the fact that there was one man who was here who ended up actually being killed, who's very important for American history and understanding how complex things really are, and his name was Crispus Attucks. So this man who ends up getting killed was an ex-slave, and he was of both African as well as Native American ancestry. And I think that's really important for us to think about as we move forward, thinking about this age of revolutions. This wasn't the typical person that you think about when you think about the American Revolution, like a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson, but this is an ordinary person who came from extraordinary circumstances who ends up being killed in the Boston Massacre. So to continue the story, the nervous guard who was having things thrown at him ended up calling for help, and Captain Thomas Preston arrived at the scene with 7 British soldiers. He appealed to the men to please disperse and to leave the crowd, and instead they started throwing more snowball stones and other objects in greater numbers. A gun was fired soon, and after this you heard a lot of shooting that came out. Someone really yelled that they should shoot, and no one really quite knows who it was or what side it came from, but 11 men in the crowd were killed, and 4 were killed on the spot, again including Crispus Attucks. You can do more research into this if you would like, or if you want to know more about it, feel free to send me an email and I'm more than happy to talk with you about it. This is the most traditional picture that is shown with the Boston Massacre. And if you haven't seen it before, it's actually a lot of propaganda. You can see that there's a poor dog up here, and of course these men, they look like gentlemen, and they have been slain by these ruthless British soldiers. In reality, the people in the crowd probably wouldn't have been dressed this nicely. They wouldn't have been just gentlemen who were wealthy walking around. This is more of your common person. And another thing that you can't really always see in this picture is any diversity that might have actually been in Boston at the time. But it's important to keep in mind not only Crispus Attucks, but also just the Boston Massacre in general, and how that really is showing the tensions that are boiling over at the time. Now, again, for this class, we're not going to get into all of the major wars that take place as far as like the battles and who wins and the numbers of people killed and things like that. If you want to know more about that, feel free to send me an email and I would be more than happy to send you the PowerPoint that I use in American history, which goes through a lot more details, and happy to talk with you about that if that's something that you're interested in. But one thing we need to think about are these revolutionary ideals that are supposed to be leading this revolution and the way they sort of play out. So the first one to think about is going to be popular sovereignty. So between 1776 and 1777, there were 10 new constitutions in 10 different states that were put into place. And they were definitely more Republican than they had been before. The idea of popular sovereignty was seen in the Virginia Bill of Rights. They were worried about power. In Pennsylvania, there was the most democratic constitution. There was a unicameral legislature whose delegates were elected annually, all by male taxpayers. Instead of a governor, the Pennsylvania Constitution also created a popularly elected executive council headed by a very, very weak president. All bills, in addition to this, had to be printed for consideration, and the people would be able to sort of vote on a lot of laws before they would be able to become law. That's really important to think about, the fact that more people are being included in these places, but this doesn't mean it's the same in all the states. These are just state constitutions. In addition to that, you start to see this push for more political equality or social equality, but I put a question mark next to that on the PowerPoint because what does that really mean? So, one thing that we can see that it means is that more people are going to be involved in politics. Instead of politics being reserved only for the most educated men and elite men, you're going to start to see more common men who are going to be part of this political arena. And the common man also having the right to vote, meaning that people have to appeal to the common man if they want to be elected. However, that does not mean that there's going to be this sort of like social equality. You're still going to have different social classes, and of course other factors like gender and race are still going to keep people from being able to participate politically. So in a lot of areas, including places like Pennsylvania, you're going to see limitations on what free African Americans can do as far as, you know, working in politics. In addition to that, you are also going to see that slavery still exists in these colonies, and slavery isn't something that they are trying to be radical in abolishing in most of the colonies. You can also see with the Articles of Confederation, as well as with Pennsylvania's Constitution that we just talked about, that the colonists are very, very wary of an absolute monarch and someone having absolute power. You can see this in the fact that in Pennsylvania, they are going to have an entire council that is supposed to make up the executive, led by a very weak president. But then you can also see that with the Articles of Confederation, where essentially the states are going to have this loose friendship with one another. And the Articles of Confederation is the first government before the Constitution. And in this government, basically the states can ask each other for help, but they can't, there's no one really central government that's very powerful. The federal government doesn't have the power to even tax people. So very, very weak, really wary of having a monarch, and kind of, in a way, experimenting with these Republican and Democratic ideals that are part of this age of revolutions. Now, of course, we know that it doesn't work out because we aren't still under the Articles of Confederation today. However, it's interesting to think about the first sort of ideas that they had. So the last thing that we're going to talk about for this class is going to be thinking about women, Native Americans, and African Americans. So what I'm going to give you, since I'm already, extending the video a bit here, is to give you like a brief overview of the role of women, or the other groups as well. And then for yourself, for this week's readings, you'll be able to delve a little bit deeper into these stories. So as far as women in the Revolution, women, a lot of times, if they were patriots, if they were on the side of the colonists, then they would be camp followers, and they would provide food, laundry services, sewing, as well as other material resources to the soldiers. So a lot of young women were active doing that. However, one woman in particular, Deborah Sampson, who I have pictured right here, she actually ends up fighting in the Revolution disguised as a man and is only found out much later on. Another woman who is very important, especially if we're thinking about this class and we're thinking about the culture of the Revolution, is going to be Phillis Wheatley. So she is an African American poet of Boston, and her owners actually taught her to read and write. And she published a collection of poems in 1776 and sent a copy to George Washington. And he really liked her poems. And she also wrote a lot of more patriotic poems and also some about Washington himself. So if you want to look up more on her, there's a lot of excellent videos out there, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that as well. But you can see in this that women are active in the revolution, and they are pushing to have more rights. However, as we know, in the aftermath of the revolution, women will continue to be excluded from the political arena. The next group to think about is really going to be Native Americans. And of course, this is much more complex than just what side will Native Americans support, because there's definitely more than one Native American group in North America at this time. In some areas, patriots organize local committees, courts, and assemblies to assume governance should the British lose their authority. However, in a lot of areas, especially in Virginia, slaves and white servants fled to British ships or flocked to Lord Dunmore. A lot of Native Americans are also going to give their loyalties to the British. And essentially, the British are promising this freedom and this victory to anyone who comes to their side. So you see that a lot of Native Americans want to fight for the British because they think it's going to be their best option. So in May of 1775, Guy Johnson, who was the British superintendent for Indian Affairs for the northern colonies, left Albany, New York, and sought refuge in Canada. He was accompanied by 120 British loyalists and 90 Mohawk warriors. The latter were led by the mission-educated chief of the Mohawks, Joseph Brant, who is where your primary source for this week comes from. He had translated the Anglican prayer book into Mohawk, and he had also fought with the British in the French and Indian War. Essentially, what I'm trying to get you to see with this is that a lot of Native Americans choose the side of the British. You have to also think that things like the Proclamation Law of 1763 helped to show Native Americans that a lot of them would be better protected by the British than by the colonists who were constantly at war with them at their borders. However, with the Declaration of Independence, many people started to feel more pressure, and a lot of people felt that they had to pick a side. So even different Native American groups who maybe didn't want to pick a side, they now feel like they absolutely have to. The majority of Native Americans ultimately sided with the British. However, you do have some who sided with the Patriots, but even those who did, they didn't have a good outcome at the end of the war, and their land still was not protected. If we're thinking about African Americans in the Revolution, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. First and foremost, there are a lot of free African Americans who are going to choose to side with the Americans, with the colonists. The reason why they choose to do this is because they believe that the colonists, should they win, they're talking about all these radical ideas, and they're hoping that they will be able to have more equality and more freedom. Now, for some people, that means ending slavery. However, for others, that just means more rights for free African Americans, so that African American men have the same rights as white men if they are free. However, there's also a lot of people who are enslaved, and they have to make decisions on which side they should fight on as well. So you heard me mention earlier a man named Lord Dunmore, and what he does essentially is he says that any slave who is able to make it to the British lines, should he serve the British, that they would be granted their freedom. And for a lot of people who are enslaved, this is a very, very good offer. Later on, you'll see that the Patriots do something somewhat similar in some areas. So places like Boston and Pennsylvania that maybe don't have as many slaves, they will offer that if slaves are willing to fight and to help, that they will gain their freedom. But a lot of times this is more on a person by person basis, depending on the person who owns the slaves, on whether or not they are willing to grant that freedom or not. But what I hope you'll see in the readings for this week, especially with the primary source on the enslaved, is that a lot of the language that's used about the revolution, ideas of liberty, freedom, equality for all, that doesn't translate in reality, especially when it comes to the enslaved. So really, you're thinking more about liberty and equality for some, depending on who they are. I think that's really important to keep in mind with this Atlantic world. While it is changing, while there are all of these revolutions taking place, what they mean and what these revolutions are for is definitely not always as it seems. But hopefully you've learned a couple of new things today. Definitely make sure to do those readings. And if you have any questions for this week, please feel free to send me an email, or if you want to know more about something, then just let me know. And otherwise, I hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you in the next video.